I stood on the dock behind my late father's boathouse, watching a man I'd never met load a cooler onto the deck of a 1987 Chris Craft that had been sitting under a tarp in that slip for 11 years, and when he saw me he waved like we were old friends and said, "You must be the maintenance guy." Marina said someone might stop by about the bilge pump. Behind him, taped to the windshield, was a printed sheet with a logo on it. Half Moon Charters, Captain Ray. 4.9 stars, 62 reviews. My name is Ray. That's the part that still gets me, even now. My own son had put my name on the boat, on the listing, on the whole operation, because guests trust a captain named Ray more than they trust a captain named Danny. Danny is my son. Danny is 34 years old, and for the past 11 months, he had been secretly running charter fishing trips on my father's boat, using my name. My license number scanned off a photo in my wallet he must have taken at some point, without me noticing, and a boat I hadn't so much as started the engine on since the funeral. I'm 68 years old. I spent 41 years running conduit and pulling wire for the electricians local out of Baltimore. Retired 6 years ago with a pension and a bad knee, and a wife named Carol, who has put up with more of my nonsense than any woman should have to. And before I tell you the rest of this, I want you to understand something about me, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am not a man who likes attention. I've never raised my voice at a Thanksgiving table in my life, and I am telling you this story anyway, out loud, to strangers, because I came within about 6 inches of losing my son over a boat, and I got him back by doing something I should have done 20 years earlier. I stopped. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the details matter, every single one of them. It was a Saturday in late April, first real warm weekend of the year, and I'd promised myself all winter I was finally going to get down to the marina and check on my father's boat before the season got going. That boat had sat in Slip 14 at Miller's Point Marina on the Chesapeake since 1987, the year my father bought her second-hand from a waterman in Deal who was getting out of the business. Dad named her the Evelyn May, after my mother, and for 30 years that boat was the only thing in his life he loved as much as her. He passed in 2015, and I hadn't had the heart to sell her, and I hadn't had the stomach to really use her either, not without him standing at the wheel barking directions about the current. So she sat. I paid the slip fee every year like a man tending a grave, and that was about the extent of it. I drove down that morning with a thermos of coffee and a list in my head, check the batteries, look at the hull, see if the old girl needed anything before I called it another quiet season. I parked in the gravel lot where I've parked for going on 40 years, and I walked down the dock, and that's when I saw a man in a fishing vest loading a cooler onto my father's boat like he owned it. For about 10 seconds I genuinely thought I had the wrong slip. I looked at the number painted on the piling, 14, mine. I looked at the brass cleat my father had installed himself, the one with the little ding in it from where he'd dropped a wrench in 1991 and cussed about it for a week. Mine. Then the man turned around, friendly as could be, and told me maintenance might be stopping by, and I stood there like a fence post, while he pulled out his phone to show me the booking confirmation, because I clearly looked like a confused old man who'd wandered onto the wrong boat. I will remember that phone screen for the rest of my life. Photos of the Evelyn May at sunset, cleaned up, bright work gleaming, fishing rods racked along the gunwale that weren't ours. Photos of my father's steering wheel, the one with the cracked grip he never got around to replacing, captioned, "Original 1980s Charm," 62 reviews. Guests writing things like, "Captain Ray really knows these waters. You can tell fishing runs in his family." One review said, "Ray told us his dad taught him to read the water out here 50 years ago. You could feel the history on that boat. His grandfather did teach him to read that water." That part wasn't even a lie, not exactly. That's what made it so hard to breathe standing there. And painted fresh over the transom, where for 38 years it had said Evelyn May in my father's own hand-lettered script, was a new name in some slick vinyl decal, Half Moon Charters. I didn't yell. I want you to know that up front, because I know how these stories usually go, and this one doesn't go that way, not at first. I told the man in the fishing vest the bilge pump was probably fine, wished him good fishing, and I walked to the end of the dock and sat down on a piling like a man who'd been knocked overboard and washed up on his own property, because that's exactly what it felt like. If you have ever found out that somebody you raised has been living a whole second life right alongside the one you thought you knew, you already understand what I mean when I say the first feeling isn't anger. Anger shows up later, And honestly, it's almost a relief when it finally does. The first feeling is the ground going soft under you. It doesn't disappear. It just quietly stops being yours. I sat on that dock for the better part of an hour, and the memories came whether I wanted them or not. My father, Walter, was a waterman's son who became a machinist, and he bought that boat with money he'd saved doing side work for 15 years, cash only, nothing on credit, ever. He used to say a loan was just a way of paying for something twice. He taught me to run that boat the summer I turned 19, how to read a chop, how to back her into a slip against the current without embarrassing yourself in front of the whole marina, how to gut a rockfish clean in 4 strokes. He was not a warm man in the way people mean that word now. He didn't say I love you so I could count on one hand the times I heard it. But he'd stand next to me at that wheel for 6 hours at a stretch, correcting my hands on the throttle without a word of complaint, and that was his whole language of love, right there, patient as tide. My son Danny learned to fish off the stern of that same boat. I can still see him at 7 years old, life vest up around his ears, reeling in a 2-pound spot like he'd landed a marlin, screaming with the pure joy only a kid can manage. I taught him the way my father taught me. Steady hands. Read the water before you read the fish finder. And somewhere in there, without either of us noticing exactly when, I also taught him something else. That whenever Danny got himself into a spot, his old man would find a way to get him out of it, quietly, no questions that stuck. I need to be honest with you about my son now, because it would be the easiest thing in the world to make him the villain here, and he isn't one. He's something more common than that, and harder to talk about. Danny is charming, genuinely likable, the kind of guy who remembers the name of your dog and asks about your surgery. He went into commercial real estate leasing right out of college, and for a good 5 or 6 years he was flying big deals, a leased truck with heated seats, a house in a development where all the mailboxes match and the lawns get sprayed by the same company. He married a wonderful girl named Melissa, and between the two of them they built a life that looked, from the outside, like something out of a catalog. Then commercial leasing dried up the way these things do. The market turned. Danny's income didn't just dip, it fell off a cliff, and it stayed there for the better part of 2 years. But the truck lease didn't shrink. The membership at the golf club didn't pause itself. The image, which is always the most expensive thing in any household, didn't blink even once. And instead of walking into my kitchen and sitting down across from me and Carol and saying 5 honest words, "Dad, I'm in trouble," my son found himself a quieter solution. A boat his parents used maybe 4 times a year. A spare set of keys he'd had since he was 17. His grandfather's boat, photographed at golden hour. Listed on an app under a captain's name that wasn't a lie, exactly, just borrowed. 11 months, 62 charters, a little over $29,000, every cent of it already spent. I found out those exact numbers later, and I'll tell you precisely how, because the how matters more than the number. But first I have to own my part in this, because if I don't, this story turns into something cheap, and I didn't come here to tell you something cheap. For close to 30 years, I made every one of Danny's problems disappear before they had the chance to teach him a single thing. When he was 23 and the credit cards had gotten away from him, $7,000 deep, I drove over to his apartment that same night and wrote him a check at his kitchen counter inside of 2 minutes, because watching the relief flood his face felt better to me than almost anything in the world. His relief was my drug, plain and simple. I told Carol it was a one-time thing. I told myself the same lie, and I believed it every time I said it, right up until the down payment on his house came up $35,000 short, and I covered that gap too, and called it a gift, specifically so he'd never have to feel the weight of owing anybody anything. At a barbecue once, a buddy of his admired a photo of the boat on Danny's phone and said, "Man, that thing's a beauty, all yours?" And my son said, "Yep, one word." I was standing 15 feet away holding a paper plate, and I heard it clear as a bell, and I said nothing. Told myself correcting him in front of his friends would be small, ungenerous, unfatherly. I recited that same lie to myself for 3 decades, and maybe you've got your own copy of it sitting in a drawer somewhere. I'm just helping him. I never once made myself ask the harder question underneath it. Helping him become what, exactly? If you're raising kids right now, or you've already raised them, I want you to sit with that question for a second, because I didn't sit with it nearly long enough. The mistake most of us make isn't loving our kids too much. There's no such thing as that. The mistake is rescuing them so fast and so completely and so quietly that they never once get to find out they can survive the water without us standing there with our arms out. I drove home from the marina that afternoon, gripping the wheel like a nervous teenager taking his road test, because I genuinely did not trust my own hands. That night, I told Carol everything at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd once budgeted our first mortgage payment, with a legal pad and a rotary fan running because the AC was broken. She listened straight through without a single interruption, which is one of maybe 40 things about that woman I still don't deserve. When I finished, she didn't gasp and she didn't cry. She got up, poured us both a cup of decaf, sat back down, and said the sentence that reorganized the rest of my life. Ray, we didn't raise a liar. We raised a boy who never once had to tell us the truth, and then we acted surprised when he stopped. 39 years married, and she can still take the wind clean out of me, and not always gently. We sat at that table until nearly 1 a.m, and we settled on 2 things. First, no yelling, no scene, no dragging our son's name through the mud of the whole extended family. Second, and this one cost me more than the first, no more disappearing consequences. Not one more. Whatever came next, Danny was going to be the first man in 3 generations of our family to meet the actual, undiscounted price of his own choices. I called him the following evening. I stood out in the backyard so I could pace, and Carol watched from the kitchen window with her arms crossed, and I kept my voice level as a carpenter's line and said, "The guests on Half Moon Charters left a review saying the Live Well pump was acting up. Should I take care of that, or is that the captain's job?" The silence on the line lasted 11 seconds. I counted every one. Then came the flood, and if you've ever confronted somebody right after they've been caught, you'll recognize this sequence like an old song you didn't know you still remembered the words to. First came minimizing. Dad, okay, it's not what it sounds like. Then entitlement, dressed up as logic. You guys barely take her out. She was just sitting there rotting in the slip. Then the future wheeled out as an alibi. It's going to be mine someday anyway. I was basically just managing it early. And when none of that found anywhere solid to land, the blame swung all the way around like a boom catching wind. You know what, Dad? If you'd ever once treated me like an equal instead of a kid who needs permission, maybe I wouldn't have had to do it this way. Had to. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at it, like the screen might explain that word better than my son just had. If that were you standing in your own backyard, listening to your child explain how stealing from you was somehow your fault, what would you have said? Because I had 30 years of things I'd never said stacked up in me like cordwood, and every log of it was bone dry. Instead, I asked him one question, quiet as a meter reading. How much? Another silence, longer this time. Then a number, spoken soft. Then, softer still, the sentence that changed the temperature of the whole conversation. It's gone, Dad. All of it. We've been drowning. There it was. Not greed exactly, not malice. Drowning. My son had been drowning for 2 years right in front of me, at every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every phone call where I asked how business was, and he said, can't complain, and he'd rather rent out his grandfather's boat to strangers under my own name than say the one-syllable word help, because he was so afraid of looking small next to a father and grandfather who built everything they had with their own 2 hands. I'm not excusing what he did. Hear me clearly on that. I'm telling you that in that moment I finally understood it, and understanding it hurt worse than the theft itself, because the theft was his, but the fear underneath it I'd had a hand in building that. One rescue at a time, I had taught my son that men in our family don't struggle out loud. My father taught me to save quietly. I only ever taught Danny that the saving was already done for him. I told him we'd talk in person, Saturday, down at the marina. Then I hung up and stood in my dark backyard a long while before I went inside and did something I hadn't done since Carol's hip surgery scared us both half to death back in 2018. I sat down at the kitchen table and made a list of hard things, in order. That week, I did 3 things I had never once done in 34 years of being Danny's father. First, I called the charter platform. It took 2 days, a copy of my actual captain's license, which, mind you, I don't even hold. My son had scanned an old fishing guide certification I'd let lapse 15 years back, and dressed it up enough to pass a copy of the boat's title, and one deeply uncomfortable phone call with a support representative named Marcus, who kept apologizing like he'd personally taken my boat out fishing himself. The listing came down that Wednesday night. 62 reviews, gone wherever reviews go once they're deleted. I confess, I read every single one first, sitting at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning, like a man reading letters addressed to a stranger wearing his face. A widow from Pennsylvania had written that her first charter after her husband passed was the only day that whole year she'd laughed out loud. A father had written that his son caught his first rockfish off Captain Ray's boat and it was the best day of the kid's life. Strangers had been given something real by my father's boat, and my father never got a lick of credit for it, and my son had cashed every check. Second, I had the locks changed on the cabin hatch, and had a marine locksmith rekey the ignition. I stood on the dock the whole time he worked, a young guy with a sunburn who talked about his own kids non-stop. When he handed me 2 new keys on a plain ring, I felt something I did not expect at all. Not victory, grief. I was locking a door inside my own chest, and I knew it, and I did it anyway, because Carol's voice was in my head saying no more disappearing consequences. Third, I made an appointment with an estate attorney named Diane Whitfield, who'd handled my mother's affairs years back, because Carol and I had a living trust drawn up when Danny was still a boy who reeled in 2-pound spot like they were trophies, and that trust left everything, the house, the retirement accounts, the boat, straight to him. It had seemed like the obvious, loving thing to do at the time. Most dangerous ideas do. I want to be very clear about what happened in Diane's office that Thursday, because this is where a story like mine usually gets misunderstood, and I know some of you will misunderstand it too. We did not cut our son out. Revenge was never the plan. Diane's known me almost 18 years, and before we opened a single folder, she looked at me over her reading glasses and asked, flat out, "Ray, are you doing this angry?" I gave her the honest answer. "Diane, if I were doing this angry, it'd be finished in 20 minutes. I wouldn't need you." What we built instead took 3 hours, 2 pots of terrible office coffee, and 1 break where I had to go stand in the hallway and breathe. We restructured the accounts into what Diane called an incentive trust, and Carol renamed it the same afternoon, and it's what we've called it ever since, the matching fund. From that point forward, our money would match Danny's money, dollar for dollar, his earned income, documented, his actual savings, his deposits into his own kid's school fund. If he built something real, our life's work would help him build it twice as tall. If he built nothing, the money would simply sit there, patient as my father's habit of saving in cash, waiting for him to start. Money as a mirror instead of money as a costume. It took me 68 years and 1 stranger loading a cooler onto my father's boat to finally understand the difference. I'm hoping it takes you a good deal less. And the boat. The boat came entirely out of the inheritance, and what we chose to do with her instead was Carol's idea, and it is, hands down, the best thing to come out of this whole mess. My wife has spent the last 9 years volunteering with a veterans support group 2 towns over, and she came to me one night, put her cold feet on my legs the way she's done since Reagan was in office, and said, "Ray, what if the Evelyn May had a job?" So now she does. Every summer, 6 weekends, free of charge, we take veterans and their families out fishing off that boat. No charge, no reviews, no captain's name that isn't mine painted anywhere on her. Just the water, and the rods, and my father's cracked steering wheel grip that we finally did replace, out of respect, not embarrassment. When we signed that page in Diane's office, Carol cried for the first time through this whole ordeal, and then she laughed right through the tears and said, "Your father just approved that." I felt it move through the room. I believe her. I felt it too. Now, Saturday, the marina. The scene I have replayed more times than any other moment of my life outside my own wedding day and the births of my 2 grandkids. I'm going to slow this all the way down, because it deserves that, and so do you. I got down there early, maybe 7 in the morning, that hard, clean light you only get in late April before the humidity sets in for the summer. I set 2 sawhorses up on the dock, climbed down into the boat, and pulled the vinyl half-moon charter's lettering off the transom with a heat gun and a putty knife, careful not to gouge the fiberglass underneath. In the little dock box where the life jackets are kept, wrapped in an old beach towel behind the spare anchor, I found the original transom board my father had actually unscrewed and saved the strip with Evelyn May hand-carved into it back before he passed. Always meaning to remount it properly, never quite getting around to it. Danny must have found it years ago and known exactly what it was, because it was wrapped like something precious, not like trash. Make of that whatever you want. I've made about a dozen different things of it myself. I was out on the dock, sanding down the transom, working with the grain, when I heard his truck on the gravel. He got out slow, and the first thing I noticed, with an ache I felt clean under my ribs, was that he looked like my father used to look at the end of a long haul, same set to the jaw, same gray, coming in early at the temples, no sunglasses, shirt wrinkled, which for Danny is about the same as another man showing up barefoot. He walked to the edge of the dock and stopped. Didn't come any closer. The water slapped against the hull. Somewhere out past the breakwater, a gull had loud opinions about the whole morning. For a solid minute, a real one, I'd stake money on it. The only sounds in the world were sandpaper, water, and that bird. He spoke first. You changed the locks. I did. He looked at the sawhorses, and I watched him understand exactly what was laid across them, watched that understanding move through him like a current finding ground. You found the board. I'm putting the right name back on her, I said. And then I watched my son's face do something I don't think I'll ever fully manage to describe. The anger came first, right on schedule, jaw-setting, breath-gathering for the argument he'd clearly rehearsed the whole drive down. It reached around for something to grab onto, some unfairness, some loophole, some had to, and it found nothing, because there was nothing there to find. There was just his grandfather's board, and his father's hands sanding it smooth, and the water where he'd learned to fish sitting right there in that honest morning light. And I watched the anger fold in on itself, floor by floor, down into whatever had been holding it up the whole time. His shoulders dropped a couple inches. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked wide open on the very first word. Do you know what it's like being your son? I set the sandpaper down. Carol, up on the dock behind me with 2 coffees she'd poured and never delivered, went completely still. And Danny said it all right there in the gravel lot. And I made myself stand there and take every last word of it without flinching, because I understood somehow that this was the first fully honest thing my son had said out loud to me in years, and if I so much as breathed wrong, it might never come again. He told me he'd spent his whole life hearing what a straight arrow his father was. That at my retirement dinner, a dozen guys stood up one after another with stories about me wiring a widow's whole house for free, covering a co-worker's union dues the year his kid got sick, never once taking a shortcut on a job. And Danny sat at the back table doing the math in his head, realizing he didn't own one single thing outright that he hadn't been handed. He told me that when the leasing market gutted his income, he lay awake doing a different kind of math, and the thought of sitting down at our kitchen table and saying the words, "I'm failing," felt, in his own phrase, not mine, like RSVPing to his own funeral. So he found a way to keep the costume zipped up. I told myself I was just borrowing against my own future, he said. Then he looked at the board on the sawhorses, and his chin went, and he said the thing that finally broke me clean through. It was your past I was selling. I know that now. I knew it then, too. That's the part I can't live with. Then he looked past me, out at the water, and said quietly, You used to stand out past the sandbar so I'd swim out to you. Nobody tells you this part about being a father, so I'll tell you now. The hardest part was never the sacrifices. Honestly, the sacrifices feel good, that's half the trap of it. The hardest part is the moment your child finally hands you the whole truth, ugly and shaking in both hands, and you have to hold it without softening a single edge of it, because softening it, sanding its corners round the way I'd been doing his whole life, is exactly what got the both of us standing on that dock in the first place. I came down off the boat. I stood in front of my son, close, the way my own father used to stand when something actually mattered, close enough that the conversation belonged only to the two of us and the gull could go mind its own business. And I said, Danny, I owe you an apology, and you owe me $29,000. And both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels out the other. He laughed, one broken syllable of a laugh that was really a sob wearing a disguise, and pressed the heel of his hand into his eyes. I told him everything right there, no lawyer's letter in the mail, no ambush, the trust, the matching fund, and exactly what it would and wouldn't ever cover again. The new locks, the boat's new job taking veterans out fishing every summer, and I watched that last part land on him differently than everything else I'd said. He stared out at the Evelyn May for a long moment, the whole boat bowed astern, and something in his face rearranged itself. I told him the boat would never belong to him outright, and then, because consequences without reasons are just cruelty wearing paperwork, I told him why. Your grandfather bought this boat with 15 years of cash he saved doing side work nobody ever thanked him for, I said. She was never an asset, son. She was a lesson. And you were charging strangers admission to a lesson you never once sat still long enough to learn. He was quiet a long, long time. The gull moved off. The coffee up on the dock went cold in Carol's hands. Then my son asked the only question in the English language that could have started us walking back toward each other. How do I fix it? Not can it be fixed, not what happens now. How do I... 68 years old, and I'm telling you that pronoun was the finest gift my son has ever handed me, grandkids included, and I will deny saying that at every family dinner until the day I die. Here's what fixing it actually looked like, and I'll warn you now, none of it was cinematic. Real repair never is. It looks like paperwork and ordinary Tuesdays. He turned in the leased truck, ate the penalty on it, bought himself an 11-year-old pickup with a check engine light 3 different mechanics have failed to diagnose. He and Melissa sat down together and built an actual budget for the first time in 10 years of marriage, and I'll tell you plainly, those first few months nearly finished them off as a couple. Melissa had married the costume too, and she had her own long, ugly look in the mirror to survive. She came to see Carol alone one afternoon, no appointment, no makeup, sat at our kitchen table and said, I kept telling him we deserved the life we were living. I never once asked what it was costing him to keep faking it. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, but Carol tells me they were both crying by the second cup of coffee, and that Melissa washed the dishes before she left, which, in Carol's private accounting system, is roughly equivalent to a signed confession and a firm handshake. They started counseling that summer. They're still in it. Some weeks are better than others. That's not a storybook ending, but it's a true one. They pulled their older boy out of the private academy and put him in the local public school, and for the record, that kid was completely fine within about a week and a half. Kids usually are. It's the parents who grieve the school crest on the sweatshirt. Danny left commercial leasing altogether, took a straight salary job at a marine supply company, of all places, running their customer service counter, spending his days talking regular folks through what kind of boat actually fits their budget and their life, talking them out of the exact kind of overreach that had nearly drowned him. Pays a fraction of his best years in leasing. He told me one Sunday in my garage that it's the first job he's ever had where he doesn't feel like he's performing for anybody. Turns out I'm pretty good at just telling people the truth, he said, and then he laughed at himself before I had the chance to, which is new and which I love. And every month, on the 1st, my son drives to our house with an envelope, $400, earned in cash. Because I told him at the marina, and I meant every word of it, that I wanted him to feel the actual physical weight of it leaving his hand, the same way his grandfather felt every dollar going into that sidework savings all those years. The envelopes don't come to me. Not a dollar of it is mine to keep. Every single one goes straight into the fund that takes veterans out fishing on the Evelyn May. My son is paying back the strangers he once charged for a seat on his grandfather's boat by buying that same seat, free, for people who actually need it. At his current pace, it'll take him a little over 5 years. He knows exactly how long. He did the math himself at my kitchen table, and when he finished, he just nodded, like a man reading a fair sentence handed down by a judge he respects. 9 envelopes so far. He has never once been late. He has never once asked for a discount. And listen to me, because this is the realest thing I know at 68 years old. Guilt gets tired. Guilt is a sprinter, shows up loud, weeps, swears things on its mother's grave, and then needs a long nap. Consistency is the marathon runner. If you want to know whether somebody in your life has actually changed, don't listen to the apology, no matter how good it sounds coming out of their mouth. Count the envelopes. Whatever the envelopes look like in your family, count them. Back in June, the first group of veterans came out on the boat. I have to tell you about one of them, because I think about him more than I probably should. A man named Curtis, 44 years old, 2 tours behind him, hadn't been out on open water since he came home 8 years back. Danny asked if he could come down the evening before to get everything squared away, and he spent the whole night restringing rods and fixing a squeaky hinge on the dock box and hiding a little waterproof tin under one of the seat cushions with 2 silver dollars inside, because, he told me, everybody ought to find something out there. Sunday afternoon, Curtis's sister sent Carol a photo. Curtis out past the breakwater, holding up a striper about as long as his forearm, grinning so wide you could see it was the first time in a long while. Carol printed that photo out. It stuck to our refrigerator, right next to the grandkids' school pictures. Danny stood in our kitchen staring at it a long time and then said, mostly to himself, 62 charters, and I never once felt anything close to that. That's the whole sermon, right there. I could stop talking now, but I owe you the ending. A few weeks back, Danny asked if he could take his own kids out on the boat for a Saturday. Asked me, out loud, for permission to use the boat he'd once listed online under his own name. And if you think that humbled him, you've missed the entire point of this story. He stood taller, asking for it, than he ever stood pretending to already own it. I said yes, on one condition, and I handed him a can of marine varnish and my father's old woodworking chisels. That Sunday, my son remounted Walter's original transom board back onto the Evelyn May with his own 2 hands, corners square, while his kids held the ladder and argued the whole time about who was actually helping. The Evelyn May, gray oak letters and all, right back where she's always belonged. I stood on the dock with Carol's hand in mine, watching my boy work, and I swear to you, on every wire I ever pulled straight and true in 41 years, I heard my father's voice come in right off the water. "Steady hands, Danny." "They're steady, Dad. Took me 34 years, but they're finally steady." So what did all of this teach me? 3 things, and then I'll let you get on with your day. First, generosity without truth isn't love, it's sedation. I kept my son comfortable for 30 years, and comfort taught him nothing except how to need more of it, quieter and quieter, until the needing went completely underground where I couldn't see it anymore. Second, the opposite of enabling isn't punishment, and don't let anybody in your own family tell you it is. The opposite of enabling is structure. We didn't take Danny's future away from him. We bolted it to his own 2 hands, and that turned out to be the single most generous thing we ever did for him, more generous by a long shot than every check I ever wrote at every kitchen counter combined. And third, this one I'd have stitched onto a life jacket if Carol would let me. People don't change because they got caught. Getting caught just makes people better at hiding. People change when the truth finally costs less than keeping up the performance. Our whole job, as the ones who love them, is to stop paying for the performance. Here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do today, not someday. If there's an arrangement floating around in your family that everybody just quietly understands, a house, a boat, a business, someday it's all yours anyway, hanging over every holiday dinner, have the uncomfortable 5-minute conversation and make it plain. Say what's borrowed, say what's given outright, say what has to be earned, and exactly what earning it looks like. Write it down if that's what it takes. Vague generosity is the soil entitlement grows best in, and I let mine grow wild for 3 decades because the conversation felt rude to bring up. Trust me on this one. The conversation is the mercy. The silence is the cruelty. And here's the question I'd ask you to sit with tonight. The same one I sat with on the end of that dock back in April, with my whole life quietly rearranging itself behind me. Is there someone in your life you keep rescuing because deep down you're afraid of who you'd be to them if you finally stopped? Now I want to hear from you, and I mean that. Tell me, son or daughter, husband or wife, brother, sister, whoever's reading this and thinking of their own version of an Evelyn May, comment 1 if you think I got it right. The locks, the trust, the envelopes, all of it. Comment 2 if you think I went too far. That family should never come down to lawyers and repayment plans, and there was a softer road I refused to see. Comment 3 if you think I got off easy. That 30 years of quietly writing checks earns me more of the blame than I've taken, and Danny was carrying weight that was really half mine to begin with. Tell me where you're reading this from, and what time it is where you are. It still stops me cold to think a retired electrician's story about a boat on the Chesapeake might find somebody at 2 in the morning in a city I'll never see. And if you've ever been the parent who finally stopped rescuing, or the son or daughter who had to hand the costume back, I'd be grateful if you'd share a piece of it. Somebody out there is holding an envelope of their own tonight, wondering if they're the only one. From my kitchen table on the water, and from a little boat on the Chesapeake with the right name painted back on her stern, take care of your people, tell them the truth, and keep your corners square.